In this webcast, we want to use the three examples shown here to give us a stronger connection between the ideas of curved arrow notation and frontier molecular orbitals. In each case, we'll use curved arrows to identify the frontier orbitals involved, and we'll generate our curved arrows by looking at the bonds made and bonds broken. In the first example, we can see that there's a new bond that's made between chlorine and aluminum, and that no bonds are broken. We can come up with curved arrow notation to describe that process. A non-bonding pair of electrons on chlorine serving as the source of electrons, interacting with the empty orbital that's centered on aluminum, this 6-electron aluminum, and we have an N to A sigma type interaction. We simply have two molecules that can freely move until they align in a way that would maximize this coaxial sigma arrangement. In the second case, we have some more complicated bond making and bond breaking, and so that'll require us to identify all the new bonds that are made. That new carbon-carbon bond is made, and all the bonds that are broken. This pi bond is broken, as is this carbon-chlorine bond. As our source of electrons, this pi bond, which adds in some way to this sigma bond which gets broken, and the new carbon-carbon bond is formed. What we can see is that the source of electrons is a pi bond. We can recognize that because the first arrow and the tail of the first arrow in particular start from a pi pair of electrons, and they enter this carbon-chlorine sigma bond. A key thing to note is that this sigma bond is broken, as the second arrow shows, and so the sigma bond would break if we've populated sigma and sigma star. One way to think about what's going on is that that carbon-chlorine sigma bond, which was initially occupied with a pair of electrons, gains an additional pair of electrons from pi, and as the pair of electrons from pi enters into that sigma bond, we no longer have a net interaction, a net stabilizing interaction. And so, in fact, it was sigma star that accepted the pair of electrons from pi, and we can see that the frontier orbitals that are involved are pi as the source, the HOMO, and sigma star as the sink, the LUMO. And we could imagine that this could be arranged in the preferred mode of bonding, the sigma type mode of bonding. We can see that the new sigma bond that results is consistent with a sigma type interaction. Now, it's not always the case that if we draw a new sigma bond that it was a sigma type interaction, but there's no reason that a coaxial arrangement could not be obtained between the pi orbital and the sigma star orbital, the backside of that carbon-chlorine sigma bond. In the third example, it's a little bit trickier. We have to identify what bonds are made and broken, and we can see that there's a new bond between carbon and nitrogen, and in particular, it's this carbon atom right here that's going to make a bond to this nitrogen atom here. In the meantime, that comes about from breaking that carbon-carbon bond, and also one additional bond is broken. That nitrogen-nitrogen bond is broken. So we have to come up with some curved arrow notation that describes that process. And the curved arrow notation might look something like this. We could start with that sigma bond and simply migrate it into the nitrogen atom where the new sigma bond needs to be made. That breaks the carbon-carbon bond between the carbonyl group and the benzene ring. We need to continue our electron flow. Nitrogen is the byproduct of this reaction, and this bond ends up breaking. Our curved arrows that would describe that process would be something like that. So what we have is a sigma bond as the source, the very first arrow. It's being added into a nitrogen-nitrogen single bond that breaks, and the lowest lying unoccupied molecular orbital that's involved in this reaction appears to be sigma star. So we have sigma to sigma star frontier orbital interactions, and now the only question is it a sigma type interaction, a coaxial arrangement, or is it a pi type interaction? Let's erase all these lines and try to come up with what molecular orbitals are involved in that sigma to sigma star interaction. The sigma orbital is going to look something like this. There's going to be a node on each of the two atoms that are involved, and the sigma star orbital that's involved is going to look like this, with a large lobe on the backside of that bond, a change in sign followed by another lobe on the other side that will be phased opposite to the large lobe down here. Now right away, pay attention to how those orbitals are aligned with respect to one another. They are in a side-by-side overlap mode, and so if we just identify the axes, we can see that they are parallel and side-by-side, which makes it possible for that filled-empty combination to be involved in a pi-type bonding sense. And so when this reaction kicks off, the frontier orbital interactions that are involved are sigma interacting with sigma star, and it's doing so in a pi-type side-by-side fashion.